Welcome and open the lecture. Tom is co-director of the Nevin Economic Research Institute and has co-responsibility for NERI's research programme and its strategic direction. Tom specialises in economic growth, economics of innovation, Irish and European economies and fiscal policy. I think many people in the room know Tom well, but I want to give him a formal introduction and Fórsa, Tom.
Thanks, Steve. So look, I'll be very brief. Thank you everyone for coming on this rainy and windy winter night to attend the 12th annual Dónal Nevin lecture and indeed the launch of the latest edition of the Studies Quarterly Journal, which will take place later this evening after the lecture. First off, I would like to thank Katie for agreeing to chair. Katie is head of Services and Enterprise Division at Fórsa. Katie is also one of the elected vice presidents of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions and a member of the Congress Executive. Thanks also to Maynooth University's Professor Mary Murphy for agreeing to take on the lecture, and to National Economic and Social Council Director Dr. Larry O'Connell for agreeing to respond. Unfortunately, Anne and Maura Nevin are not able to attend this year as they had originally planned. On behalf of the whole NERI team, I would like to wish them both the very best, and we look forward to seeing them next time. Some of you will know the NERI and the Irish Congress of Trade Unions are currently undertaking a body of work to develop a new economic model or framework for the two economies on the island of Ireland. This policy document, which will encompass a range of discrete and overlapping areas such as productivity, economic security, sustainability, resilience, and job quality, will be launched at the ICTU Biennial Delegate Conference in Belfast next July. If the delegates agree, it will become the settled policy position of the labour movement on this island, though it will of course be very much a living document, influenced and shaped by changing context, data, and research findings. In this context, Paul McFlynn, myself, and the rest of the NERI team are delighted that our lecture today will focus on what a new all-island social settlement and eco-social contract to enable transition in the context of insecurity might actually look like, and where the labour movement might fit in. I'm also very much looking forward to Dr. O'Connell's response and the viewpoint of NESC. Finally, I'd like to thank you and the Royal Irish Academy for hosting, and my NERI colleagues, and in particular Louisa O'Brien, for doing all the actual work that goes into making these types of events a success. Here's to a thought-provoking and interesting evening. Thank you, and over to you, Katie.
Introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Mary Murphy, from the Department of Sociology at Maynooth University. Professor Murphy has research interests in eco-social welfare, gender, care and social security, globalisation and welfare states, and power and civil society. Professor Murphy was appointed to the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission and is currently a member of the Council of State in Ireland and the chairperson of Oxfam Ireland. She is Ireland's representative in the EU-wide Sustainability, Welfare and Eco-Social Policy Network and a member of the UNESCO Policy Laboratory. Mary is going to speak for around 50 minutes, and then Dr. Larry O'Connell of NESC will formally respond. The title of Mary's lecture is A New All-Island Social Settlement on Eco-Social Future of Care and Equality. Over to you, Professor Murphy.
Hi, everybody. And first of all, just thank you very much to NERI for the invitation. I feel very honoured to be asked to do this, and I'm delighted to see such a range of people, some old colleagues, some newer colleagues, and a vast amount of people that I've worked with over the past, both in academic life and beyond. So I really want to say thank you. And I have up there just acknowledging collaborations, because the work we do as academics is never done on our own. Like, I would really we'd be very careful to acknowledge the work of others and to celebrate the collaborations that we do, because we're at our best, I think, when we collaborate and when we do joint work. And work that I've done, particularly on the gender and care aspect. There are people in the room and there are people not in the room, but Pauline Cullen, Fiona Duclos and Orla O'Connor, I really want to specifically mention their part in collaborating on some of what I'm going to say today. Sometimes we've collaborated so well, I'm not really sure what's theirs and what's mine, to be honest, at this stage. And I also want to acknowledge Dr. Professor Peadar Kirby, Emeritus at University of Limerick, who I co-edited the special edition of Studies with that we're going to launch later on. And Peadar was originally my PhD supervisor in DCU, and we've long collaborated across a great many things and had a very rich working life together. So just to acknowledge that. I also just want to take one moment out. Some of you noticed I have a black eye and a broken nose and ligaments torn in my hand. I fell in Brussels on Friday last week, so I am a bit cobbled together. So apologies for the state of me, but it really brought home to me the importance of care in your life. And I really wanted to acknowledge my own children and how much they care for me, Emer and Dan, not in this country at the moment, but really a huge part of my life. And I really wanted to acknowledge them. And also my sisters, Elaine and Geraldine, who I really rely on for care. And just to acknowledge the importance of friends and family in that respect as well. I think if we're talking about care and gender equality, we need to bring out these things and start to talk more about relational, effective realities in our life and how important they are. So just to frame what I'm saying in that way. Some of you will be aware of that book, Creating an Eco-Social Welfare Future, which got launched in last year in 23. And it got shortlisted for the Richard Titmuss Social Policy Award by the British Social Policy Association earlier this year. The web is part of the book and it relates to the structure of what I want to say today. The yellow refers to kind of what's wrong. The blue is what's the answer, what are the solutions, and the red is how to get there. And that's very much what way I want to structure what I'm talking about there. And the conclusion will talk to the tensions that there are in trying to get there democratically and fairly, but also quickly. And the urgency of the challenge that we have and how we process what we do, but accelerate the change that we need. That's no easy task. And I think it's a tension that we all need to learn about. So first of all, just a little bit more of an introduction to me, and thank you for the introduction earlier. I call myself a pracademic. So it's somebody who's crossed the boundaries between policy work and other types of careers into the academic world and sometimes back out again. I think that crossing boundaries is important because it brings academic theory into practical policy work and vice versa, and it grounds academic work. And I think it's an important way to approach policy and politics, academia and civil society, and other aspects of work as well. In my 6th decade now, I've seen a lot of change and worked for a lot of change over 4 decades now. And all I can say is that it falls very slowly. Change. It does happen, but it happens over decades rather than over the short, sharp campaigns that we're very fond of setting up. So that's why I think we're really challenged to accelerate change and to put it into a temporal framework that's more appropriate to the societal challenges we're facing now. I'm on sabbatical at the moment, and I've just been in Brussels working with the European Trade Union Institute. So it's very fitting this overlap with this talk here today. And looking at the European Green Deal, looking at the Just Transition framework in Europe, and trying to understand how we can practically advance income supports and transition aids that will really enable just transition to happen, both at a European policy level and how that can fall down to member states in a way that really does leave no one behind and fits in with minimum incomes. So taking the theory and trying to put it into practice. So I'm very much caught on that at the moment, to just transition as how can we make it a transformative tool for security and for eco-social innovation? And how can we do that fast? And that's kind of where I'm at the moment. So my own worldview is as a political sociologist, and most sociologists will tell you that the world is socially constructed. And therefore we can reconstruct it in ways of our choosing if we get our politics right. And those two images are two very famous things. One is it's easier to imagine the end of the world and the end of capitalism, a very famous quote, which I really don't like. I'm putting it up to contrast it with Ursula Le Guin's quote. We live in capitalism, its power seems inescapable, but then so did the divine right of kings. And she says, any human power can be resisted by and changed by human beings. And I take great hope from that kind of philosophy that does accept the real power that's there, but the reality is that humans have changed serious power over millennia, and that's what we're about, and that we shouldn't be so daunted by it. So my theory of change is closely aligned to that. But having said that, I reject any theories of change that think that they know what they're talking about. So this, I love this diagram here. The writing says, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2, which is sort of taking the P out of people who think that they can really explain how change happened. And the idea of that the role of the state in change is really about the state steering rather than rowing or doing. But really what the state is trying to steer is really a very fast flowing river that you can't really steer in. You just get in and go along for the ride. So I think sometimes we expect too much of our theories when we're trying to really explain how things happen in the real world. Having said that, I'm going to try and give you a theory of change that I'm working with that I find useful for thinking about the transition to a more transformative type of agenda. And it comes from the idea that there's a glass ceiling at the moment on transformation. Some of it we're kind of stuck when it comes to really thinking transformatively and making transformative change happen. Robin Eckelsley works with critical problem solving, where she thinks it's really important that, you know, we need to think big about the transformative change that we want, but then we need to be able to drill it back down to the practical transition steps towards that big change. So she talks about identifying the best transition steps towards transformation. It's very in keeping with the idea of revolutionary reform or non-reformist reforms, the idea that there are certain things that you can do that will get you along the road to where you need to go. I think all of them are challenged, though, in that we need to get there faster than maybe those theories allow for. I think it's useful to separate the idea of politics and policy. And I certainly saw this in the European work that the ETUI are doing, where they're very fixated on policy. And sometimes they're trying to write policy and describe and identify policy solutions for things that there is no political demand for. And I kept telling them, you've got to go out and create the political demand for this before you identify what the policy solution is. I think a lot of us focus on the policy and that we really need to get our heads out on creating demand and being more political in what way we're engaging with some of the framing. And I think there's a difference in what we do as campaigns and strategies if we're trying to create demand for something than if we're trying to influence how it might be supplied. And that's what that refers to there. Lastly, in my theory of change, I really do believe in the power of ideas. I think framing is really, really important. And I know the trade union movement are very fond of quoting Keynes, and there's a really famous one of ideas, but this is my favourite one that he said around ideas. And the difficulty lies not so much in identifying new ideas, but in escaping the old ideas. The people who say, but you can't do that, but that's not how it works. I do think that there is a real problem with cognitive locks, like that our minds are locked into a very narrow range of what we believe is possible. And that's why I think policy, institutional imagination, welfare imagination is really important in helping us open up those cognitive locks and thinking about other things. And that's why it's really important that we do merge different types of knowledge, and why academics are important. People who can cross boundaries are better at bringing different bits of knowledge with them. But the knowledge of both workers and users of services is really important, and it rarely does get into the room properly. So that's sort of where I am. The idea, eco-social, is really the big idea, the transformation idea. I see it as a North Star or a compass bearing a direction of travel. But really what we're about is the first steps in the direction of travel, because we can't really identify the whole agenda or the blueprint for that journey. And that's really what I want to try and do today, is identify some of the first steps that maybe might bring into being an eco-social contract as a tool of transformation towards the end. So part one, I wanted to identify what the problem is, and I won't dwell on this because I feel the room would largely be able to identify this, but the problem of climate inequality, north and south of the island and globally. So inequality and climate change, I mean, in a nutshell, I think wealth inequality can be understood as the cause of a lot of climate emission problems, and then inequality in incomes, in services, in power can be described as the effect of those kind of impacts of climate change, where those who did least will suffer most. And particularly when we bring gender and other intersectional inequalities into the picture, that's what we see. And it's really important, I think, that focus on inequality and wealth. Never say poverty without saying wealth, because they really are two sides of the same coin. But so too, inequality and carbon emissions are two sides of a similar coin and really need to be thought of in a conjoined way. And they're not inevitable. Neither of them are inevitable. They're an outcome of the political economy that we have politically put together. So the arguments that I want to make are for a transformation of both welfare and climate policy that really help each other to get to where they need to go together at the same time. And just on, they say never put more than 4 statistics into a talk, so you're getting 3 of them now, and we'll get them out of the way. But this chart is very well known, and it shows the reality of the inequality, where the top layer, the top 40, the top 1% produce 49% of emissions, and the bottom 50% produce less than 10% of emissions. And it's that crude, it's that basic, it's that factual. I learned the other day for the first time that when we look at aviation emissions, that 50% of the emissions are produced by 1% of the people, largely business clients who are flying a lot and private jet owners, but 50% of emissions produced by 1% of the population. So in an Irish context, we see that emissions, the top 0.1% produce nearly 300 emissions, compared to the bottom 50% producing very, very few. So we can see that the reality of the inequality is very, very significant. And those who are least responsible are more vulnerable to the impacts. They bear greater burdens in mitigation and adaptation. They benefit least from those policies, and they have the least power to influence what those policies are. So inequality is really, really at the heart of it. And I mentioned earlier that gender inequality is really at the heart of it. And I think this is an area that we need to work harder at understanding, because care inequality contributes very significantly to gender inequality, and particularly to pension and pay gaps. But also climate inequality contributes very significantly to care inequality, where if we think of Valencia and the floods that happened in Valencia, for example, the reality of the care implications of what happens for people putting together their lives after those floods, the day-to-day effective work that will happen in people putting together their lives will be largely borne by the women in Valencia. Both direct care work, but also indirect social reproduction work, getting kids to school, all that type of thing that we don't really factor into enough when we're talking about care and inequality. So I think we need to do an awful lot more to think about what that means. We're also talking about wages and salaries as a share of national income diminishing. And this is actually a global picture of what that looks like. But I think the point about it is that that level of inequality, and we see it in conflicts all over the place now in France and Germany, it's undermining social cohesion, it's undermining the capacity to build revenue for the types of changes that are needed, and it's leading to that decline in trust, the decline in sense of belonging that people have. So inequality really does erode human relationships and really does impact on democracy in that sense as well. Just in relation to the impact of inequality on climate change, this is Donut economics, Kate Raworth's concept of donut economics. And for those of you who are familiar with it, the idea is that you get inside the green area where you can live a life that meets human needs in a way that doesn't disrespect planetary boundaries. This assessment was done on Ireland in 2015, and the red indicates where Ireland is stepping outside and damaging planetary boundaries of all types, including climate change, but also biodiversity, water quality, and the like. The blue area, the little bits of red that you can see in the blue area, that's where Ireland is failing to meet human needs. So I think this is quite a good way of assessing how Ireland is doing from a much more an understanding that what we're trying to do is about meeting human needs and in a way that's respecting planetary boundaries. But if we look at it in a more general sense, we can see that there are serious questions about our capacity to reach our climate targets. There was talk this morning of the bill being 20 billion if we don't meet them. But the reality is it doesn't matter how much it costs not meeting them, because the real cost of not meeting them is global warming. That's the real cost. It's not the monetary cost that we need to be focusing on. And it worries me a bit that we're framing it so much in monetary costs that we're beginning to miss the picture on it. In a Northern Ireland context, there is a Northern Ireland Climate Change Act, which was delivered from the ground up and was a fantastic example of people power. But there are real issues in Northern Ireland of having the data at a Northern Ireland level to measure some of the indicators that are there in the Climate Act to make sure that the actual emissions do reach zero. And already from the data they do know, there are some issues in whether or not those targets can be met. But the bigger issue is they simply don't have data to assess in a lot of the areas as well. And then more generally, it is very difficult to assess the degree to which inequality north and south The data gaps are very significant. A lot of the data isn't collected at a Northern Ireland level. It's not disaggregated to Northern Ireland. So it is difficult to actually make some comparative issues. This was work I did that was published in 2022 that used mainly 2021 data. But it does show that we can make some broad stroke indicators on trying to get a sense of what the outcomes of inequality are north and south. And we can see that there are problems in Ireland, north and south. And sometimes the problems are quite similar. And Tom MacDonald did some work in the work that he referenced earlier about the work that NERI are doing to help prepare ICTU for a position paper in the 2025 biannual conference. And he concluded that assessing the differences between north and south is hard. There are data deficits. There are also path dependencies where different welfare states go in different directions depending on what way they start out. So that makes it harder. But he did conclude both the Republic of Ireland and the UK are relatively threadbare as in their social security systems by European standards. And that there were some comparative ways that things look kind of similar. In 2023, the Republic of Ireland had 17.3% enforced deprivation, whereas in the UK, absolute poverty could be measured at 18%. So some of the issues were similar. Minimum wage targets of 66% of median earnings compared to Republic of Ireland's 60% target of median earnings, but to move to 66%. So there's some alignment of some fairly big policy areas that give some starting points to discussion. Both jurisdictions have relatively low tax efforts, for example. Both are low on employers' PRSI. So there's areas that are common that you can see common campaigns would be quite possible. But work I did with Rod Hick in the pandemic analysis showed quite different approaches to the pandemic in income supports from the two jurisdictions. Some good, some bad in both, but it's difficult to get an overall picture. And the same can be said when it comes to trying to compare basic services, because some services are universal in the south, some in the north, and it's difficult to get an overall assessment of the quality of life in each area. All that said, and deficits aside, and this is where I think we shouldn't get bogged down in detail that stops us thinking imaginatively about what the big picture can be, because I want to argue that it should be possible to think from an eco-social perspective and a just transition perspective of the idea of an all-island eco-social contract. And we think of just transition primarily as a climate just transition. We talk about it as just transition from fossil fuels. In the south, it's talked about a lot in terms of just transition in agriculture. But we're also talking about other types of transition on the island. We're talking about new constitutional settlements. We're talking about possible new shaping of Ireland north and south. So the idea would be that the transitions can be very broad. They can be understood as constitutional transitions, ecos transitions, job transitions, digital transitions, transitions we don't even know will happen yet. And something needs to happen to bring together them into a way that people can understand how the future would look for them in the context of what would come out of a transition period. And my argument is that the concept of an all-island eco-social contract can help us tie together some ideas. So for the words eco-social refers to the explicit combined pursuit of ecological goals like, say, decarbonisation or lowering carbon emissions, with social protection goals like social justice or lowering inequality. So there are policies that at the same time and through the same method, hopefully, will hit at both the climate objectives and the inequality objectives. Whereas just transition is a bit narrower. It really refers to those policies that will enable fossil fuel industries to be phased out in order to bring in decarbonised industries, or agricultural practices to change in order to bring about decarbonised agriculture. So it's very focused on the decarbonised aspect of the policy goal, but that it would be done in a way that's just and would bring everybody forward. So eco-social is slightly bigger than just transition. We can think of just transition as a subset maybe of eco-social. But either way, I do think bringing these concepts forward in the context of thinking about the island and constitutional change in the island and bridging these things together is a way of helping us think outside the box a little bit. That's part one. Part two, I say about unequal social contracts because I think fundamentally the issue of insecurity is a really useful way of thinking about how people feel about transition and about change and about the fear that they might have of transformation. Trump just appointed a representative, Lori Chavez de Raymer, as the Secretary of State in the new administration. And you might think this is a strange opening point to me, but Robert Reich was appointed by Bill Clinton to be his Secretary of Labour in that administration in 1993. And he's really famous in that he was talking about the information technology transition and what needed to happen for people to feel secure transitioning at that period of time, which when we look back seemed relatively easy, but at the time it wasn't easy and there was a lot of fears about would people lose their jobs, what way would information technology affect people. But a quote that he said at the time really stuck with me my whole life. And he said, if people don't have security about the future, they will look for security in the past. And I think, to my mind, that really stuck with me in terms of understanding about security. Frances Perkins was the Secretary of Labour in the American Roosevelt administration in 1933. And she had witnessed the death of 145 people in the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire in 1911. And when Roosevelt asked her, and this was in the context of the Great Depression and the war on hunger and like a really serious social devastation in the United States in the early 1930s, Roosevelt asked her to be the Secretary of State for Labour. And she said no, unless he would implement what she called Social Security legislation. She basically had a blueprint for the welfare state of America in her back pocket. And she took it out and she said, this is my price for being Secretary of Labour. And her motto was ready now. And I really took from her the real importance of having a vision of what the future would be, but doing the work to be actually ready to be in the right place at the right time and say, actually, this is what we need. So in some respects, the welfare, the New Deal that we all talk about now and that has inspired the Green Deals both in America and Europe really was fashioned by Frances Perkins and her motto ready now. So I think a lot to be learned from American Secretaries of State. Not sure what we learn from Trump's new appointment, but watch that space. There's a new book out on the age of insecurity by Astor Taylor, who's actually a Canadian filmmaker. But I thought it was interesting because she captured that idea of security being at the heart of the social contract. And she defines insecurity as the inability to look forward and make sense of the past, present and future. And I suppose that's what we hear a lot of if we think of the recent general election, for example. That sense of, people don't have a sense of the future. They don't have a sense of the alternatives. They don't have a sense of what's coming next. And they feel lost without that. And they feel not able to make sense of the past enough because they can't make sense of the future. And so insecurity has a fairly profound impact on both politics and culture. And it can lead to solidarity. It can lead us to all saying, we've got no future together, so we need to work together if it's harnessed in one particular way. But it can lead to quite isolated, narrow insider kind of concepts where we say we need to defend ourselves against others in the context of the future looking more threatening. So populism, it can be understood, this is Peter Hall's definition, it can be understood as a cultural struggle to a large degree, driven by uncertainty about the future and perceptions of either personal unfairness, which can often lead to right populism, or social unfairness, which can sometimes generate maybe the solidarity we might associate with left populism, but which we don't see that much of really. Maybe France is an idea. So what Astor Taylor says at the end of talking a lot about the politics of insecurity, the reality of it, the feeling of insecurity that people have is, change is inevitable. That's clear. And how do we make the change to be the change we want it to be, the transformative type of change? And she's very clear that we need to talk about politics. We need to make it into a political debate about the future, not a policy debate about what the right policy is, but a political debate about what kind of world we want to live in. Talk about values, talk about the possibilities that are there. There's no real policy blueprints for that. And her take on it is that we need to talk about an ethic of collective security that's focused on taking care of humans and nature, and a careful and a care economy. And I take great heed in what she's saying, and I like the way she frames it from insecurity to collective security. And I'm not looking for an individual answer to all that type of thing. And that brings me to Tom's work, because by coincidence, his first paper in a series of 4 papers is on economic security. And he's talking about an economic development model to address economic security, inequality, income adequacy, and well-being. And he described himself there earlier, that's in the context of the IC2 biennial decision to have a big debate about a model of development for an all-island in 2025. So I'm kind of speaking into the same theme then, which I think is quite useful to do. And I'm putting a warning on this slide. So I'm saying beware welfare nostalgia, okay? And I'm going to then totally contradict myself by being nostalgic about welfare. But I do think we do need to look towards the future. There is a tendency to look towards the past and wish it was better, you know, and that, but it is important to keep looking at the future. But I'm looking at the past for a minute, and I'm looking at it because the last time we really asked a big question about a model of development was the NESC report in 2005, the Developmental Welfare State, and they were also concerned with security at the time, and they drew on the concept of flexicurity, which was a big, you know, it was the big thing at the time. It was a Danish concept. And it was this idea, yes, we need more flexible labour markets. Yes, people will need to change their jobs a lot over their lifetime. But if we can give people a base of security through good welfare policies, good active labour market policies, then people will feel confident and secure about being able to be flexible. And that was the theory. In practice, we didn't do that. Okay, so flexicurity never really happened. And I actually wrote papers called Flex Insecurity. Is what we did, because what we did was we gave people flexibility, but we didn't give them security. We didn't make the welfare state and services as secure as they could be. So that image of the guy falling off the three-legged stool refers to the idea that we got flexible labour markets, we got active labour market policies, but we didn't get the secure welfare state as the third leg of the stool. That's a good IKEA stool, well-balanced, 3 legs. That's kind of what we needed. But that idea, I think, is important. The idea of flexicurity, I'm not suggesting that we go back to it. So I pulled out this image of a weeping willow as maybe a different way of thinking about flexicurity. Because if you think about that tree, it has very, very, very deep roots. And it enables us to be banked along rivers where the soil isn't often that strong. And its structure of leaves allows it to sway in the wind an awful lot. So it's very stable. And you don't see them falling very much, but you see them being able to move and in the wind a lot. So I think we can get some inspirations about what kind of flexicurity we're talking about for the future from other than from NESC reports. But I think it is important because that NESC report, the concept of flexicurity did inform the concept of the developmental welfare state, which was seen in its time as like the gold standard for welfare state thinking about how you would imagine a welfare state. And it was built around the idea of high quality services, strong income support, and activist measures. And that was really important. Now, I have to admit, I critiqued it at the time for not having an effective gender dimension to it, as I would, because it didn't really take social reproduction into account or make it visible in its analysis. But it is recognised as being a very useful model for welfare state thinking. So what I have done in terms of trying not to be stuck in welfare nostalgia is try and use the seeds of the past to grow models for the future. And this is kind of what I was thinking about talking about eco-social, was that enabling institutions have to be part of an eco-social model. Income supports have to be part of it, but it has to be income supports that allow people be active in their participation in the world and be very wide in how they approach it. And then universal basic services has to be part of an eco-social model. And in a bigger political economy model, we have to see how a tax system can support a welfare system. So how the economy can support a society rather than the other way around, with care as its focus rather than economic growth as its focus, and where income, services and an active state enabling an active society work together. So that's very much what I'm suggesting as a model for how we might think about the future, inspired by some of the ideas of the past, but definitely trying to move it forward. And as I've said before about taking gender seriously, making sure that care, inequality and climate are very much understood to be intrinsically linked in part of that model, where redistribution of work, time and income is needed for care inequality. So, for example, one of the enabling state institutions could be reduced working time, because not only does it actually meet some of what workers might need, it also can help us advance gender equality, care inequality and climate objectives. So there are some things that we can hit one more thing with, and taking care of ourselves, each other and the planet. So understanding care as a very broad notion of care is where I'm at. And that leads me to call the eco-social model in some circles actually a sheco-social model, because we could have a heco-social model that would have no care dimension to eco-social at all. And lots of organisations do promote eco-social models with no mention of care. So I think if we're making it very explicit, I've drawn the emphasis on the sheco-social. I don't do that often, but I do think it's really important that we're talking about a model of development that would balance state, market and society, and rather than growth and finance, would put care and equality and well-being at the centre of what we're aiming for. So we're talking about a social settlement that can help us feel secure, moving towards very significant transitions on the island, climate transitions, digital transitions, constitutional transitions, steered by goals of a more equal world as well as a more sustainable world, and looking for policies that can do both. That's sort of where we're leading towards. There's lots of ways of doing that, and I'm not going to go into that chart at all, but that's just to reassure you that there are a whole menu of policy, a palette of policy possibilities when we're talking about doing that. But basically what you're trying to find are what policies enable collective consumption to happen. So you want to get away from individuals buying what they need on the market, buying care on the market, buying transport on the market, buying education on the market. Where it's possible, you want people to meet their needs by collective consumption. That is a recipe for greater equality. It also is a recipe for reduced carbon emissions. So you're doing both at the same time with collective consumption. As I said, shorter working days, months, years can help reduce working time, can also help gender equality, care and climate. More care, less carbon. More security enables the politics of the transition to be easier. And I think we really need to take this seriously in terms of listening to what we're seeing. We're seeing massive conflict in France right now, in Germany. We're seeing the world respond in insecure ways to the challenges of trying to achieve transition. And if we don't listen to what people are saying, then we're not going to try and really advance policies that can enable people to move forward with security, because that's what they're saying. They are feeling insecure and we can't trample over people in how to do it. So I think things like job guarantees, income guarantees, minimum income guarantees, minimum wage guarantees are all important. Pension guarantees as well. That's kind of what people are saying that they want. So I'm not going to dwell on this, but for my mind, that would mean that there are 5. I talked earlier on about our mind on the big picture, but then identifying individual steps to get there. And to my mind, there are 5 basic steps to get there. The idea of enabling institutions, universal basic services, a participation income, a focus on care, and a focus on generating the right type of taxes through wealth tax and environmental taxes. And I'm going to skip the next few slides, but they basically just outline what they would be a little bit. And I'm going to finish on this one, which brings the 5 together into the idea of, well, what kind of state would you need to deliver an eco-social contract that looks like that and has those fundamental features? And I would argue that you need a quite different looking state to what we have now. You don't need a state that is delivering all the public services itself, because the state should be busy being an active enabler of others to do that type of delivery. The state should be enabling a more embedded economy to meet society's needs. So the state must focus on things like regulating, on planning, on funding, on monitoring. It should be a less doer of the services. And that's what we mean when we call a state that steers rather than that does. a state that's deeply democratic, and I think this is really important, because it would be very easy to talk about an eco-social fascist state or an eco-social authoritarian or authoritative state, and we do see those kinds of states demanded in the literature. But I do believe that democracy both has intrinsic and instrumental kind of logics that it's really important if we want the politics of transition to be managed in a way that there will be conflict, but it has to be mediated conflict and negotiated outcomes, then it has to be democratic. But our democratic institutions need to be widened and deepened to enable it to meet the challenges of negotiating that. And that means new forms of governance, both new types of actors involved, new scales of governance, and new institutional mechanisms for it. I think local government is really important in that context. So there's a summary of what I'm talking about. A NERI eco-social contract to enable transition in the context of security. So it's basically built around the purple in the middle is the state, a really active state, still really important, big actor, and then social infrastructure for universal basic services, and income support that helps us to socially value work and time. And I think Ireland is in an interesting place here. We have the basic income for artists as a model of how to use the income support system to put a social value on cultural work that we mightn't otherwise do. This general election, there were countless manifestos who said they wanted to abolish the means test for carers. Brilliant. You know, the idea of using income support to socially value care work. Great. I put forward proposals for a BIF, a basic income for farmers, which would be an amalgamation of our farm assist social welfare payment and the CAP payments, where there is a basic income for sustainable support for farmers. So it's not mad to think that we could redesign our welfare income support payments so that we loosen them and we make them enable them to be used for the lives that people need to live, to move on. So that's not my offering to NERI. And then I just wanted to finish by saying, well, how do we get there? And particularly, what's the role of trade unions and NERI in getting there? And I'm doing that through a rubric of, very basic, how does change happen? It happens through ideas, institutions, and interests, and an amalgamation of those three. So let's take each of them in turn. Ideas. Jenny Stevens is here. It's interesting. Kate Raworth, who wrote Dónal Economics, was speaking at a conference earlier this year, and she thought Ireland could be a real leader in ideas about transition. And I know Jenny thinks that as well. So it's interesting when people look at Ireland from the outside, they see real potential. And I think that's great. I think we need to be more confident about our potential and our ability to be a leader. And I think NERI have a potential role to play there, co-creating the future of ideas with others. I think that focus on fast and fair is very important. The role of economic democracy in enabling fast decision-making in transitions. The idea of the eco-social frame is important. All Ireland constitutional change, eco-social contract is a unifying frame. The ideas that could generate, and welfare, poverty, gender and care as unity issues in the debate about constitutional change. I think there's lots of ways of building on all those ideas. And just by way of illustration, there are a number of organisations who are talking about a guarantee of security through participation, income and services, and meeting human needs for autonomy, freedom and democracy through guaranteeing security. The New Economic Foundation in the UK, the Henrik Ball Stiftung in Germany, the UNESCO Policy Laboratory, they're all coming out with fairly big ideas about eco-social contracts and framing it in all that way. So I think there's a lot of actors to engage with around ideas. And then in interests, whatever the theory of change is, the role of trade unions, coalition building and solidarity and mobilisation is at the heart of trade union ideas of what trade unions are. An international organisation is important in that context. But I think trade unions' relationships with both civil society and political society is really important. And particularly when I go back to that idea about creating demand being as important as influencing how supply happens. So I think the focus on creating demand through mobilising and interest coalition. Naomi Klein talks about one of the big issues that we're facing right now is the issue of muscle and memory, she calls it. The fact that a lot of younger people have a lot of muscle, they have social media muscle, they have good mobilization capacity. Think of Black Lives Matter, super fast mobilization, but they don't have a lot of memory. They don't have a lot of institutional knowledge of how to make organizations, how to influence policy, how to make things last. So there's something that's missing in the generational overlap between memory and muscle that she's identifying needs to happen. And that's a global phenomenon. But I do think that there's a lot that the trade unions can do to develop mobilising inclusive campaigns. A lot of writers are identifying that people are saying that they have no sense of belonging. And trade unions were something in the past that people belonged to, in the way that they belonged to political parties or, you know, to local neighbourhood associations. And I think that there's a lot that trade unions can do to recreate a sense of belonging for people who are saying that they feel insecure in the context of what's happening and they want to belong. They want to anchor organisations in their lives that they can trust. I think there's an important role for trade unions there. But fundamentally, I would go with Nancy Fraser, who talks about a triple movement needed, that we need to build a critical mass of both organised labour who are focusing on production and welfare issues, the gender movement who are focusing on care and social reproduction issues, and the environmental movement, that those three spaces need to talk to each other more and act together more in order to build a critical mass for change. And so that's what that would look like. The last thing is institutions. And of course, Irish trade unions are a great friend of institutions. The trade union movement is a bit of an institution itself. It can sometimes be accused of lacking fluidity and being too institutionalised. But having said that, I think for NERI there is a lot there's a lot as an institution, as a research institution, that it can do to advance research methodologies that are co-producing kind of some of these ideas and strategies for other organisations. And it's already done really well, I think, in its fit with the higher and further education sectors. And maybe there's more work that could be done there. There's work to support trade unions in the institutions that they're in social dialogue, in the National Economic and Social Council and the LEAF. There's a lot of commissions there. There's the Low Pay Commission. There's the Just Transition Commission that's just about to begin. There's IREC. There'll be a lot of institutions about the future of the island, some not set up yet. And a lot of these are state-run institutions. And I think we do need to be mindful about keeping space for society and initiating our own space as institutions that's state-free and that leaves us free to think about and to challenge some of the state ideas about the future. So the trade unions need to play a role in convening and being a co-convener of spaces where we think about the future free of the state sometimes, if that's important. This beautiful chart is a chart of the incremental development of social protection in Ireland. It's of the south, but you could easily do the same one of the north. And the point is, it happened very slowly, bit by bit, with no great plan. And I think this is the real problem that we have now, is that the policy system in Ireland, particularly when it comes to the kind of policies that we're talking about here today, is used to very small ideas and incremental change. And it's very hard, therefore, to take a big idea and to fit it into that system of incremental change. But that's the dilemma that we have, is how do you match being able to think big time while also being able to make change in the real world. And I think that's the difficulty of working through institutions. It presents itself through that graph. And that leads me to my concluding thought about power, time and scale. I think there is power of the status quo. The path dependency of that kind of incrementalisation really defends and keeps the shape of the status quo. It's one way of protecting and not making much changes, to do it very incrementally. But history shows, and history shows us in Ireland as well as everywhere else, that things do happen big sometimes, and that people make things happen big sometimes. So I do think it's worth hanging in there. We've all been through referendums we never thought we would live to see in our lifetimes. We've been through some we lost as well, I know, but we've won some. And we can take hope from some of those stories. And we need to find ways, I think, of translating that hope to the younger generations who don't always see that hope through their own experience of life as easily as we might. So I think culture and how we tell stories and the narrative of change that we choose to tell is really important, and that we need to spend a bit of time on that. But I've said earlier then that the challenge of time is really significant for us all, particularly in a culture of incrementalism, how we accelerate the pace and scale of change from incremental to more transformative. So I just have 3 images to leave you on. First is this, and I love this as an image, and I find I am guilty of it completely. If I look back on my laptop, I can find so many things that were just rearranging deck chairs, honestly. Like at least half my laptop is full of stuff that it didn't matter whether I did it or not. And I might just delete it now and pretend I never did it. And I'm sure I'm not the only one in the room who could think that. So we need to stop doing things that are a waste of time, basically. And we need to focus on things that are important. I think that's what's important is, systemic transformation. Social acupuncture, I really like the concept of social acupuncture. It's the idea of, like acupuncture, it's taking a very small needle, putting it in the right place at the right time, at the right pressure, big change. So if you can find the right thing to do, you can actually achieve very significant change. And these 2 images from nature give us some indication of that. We often think of ostriches as the birds with their heads in the sand, ignoring everything. But when they do take their heads out of the sand and they decide to do something, they can run 70k an hour in 30 minutes. So they're very quick. And geese fly in a V formation because they fly 71% faster by collaborating how they fly, by helping each other with velocity and acceleration. So there's some hints from nature there as to how to speed up change and how to do things quickly that I quite like. The last slide I want to leave you with is one of hope and trust in each other. I took great, I'm sure like everybody else, I was really shocked at the floods in Valencia, but I was really moved to tears by the response of the volunteers who came in droves to try and help. And it really reminded me of Rebecca Solnit wrote about it in the context of New Orleans and the flooding in New Orleans in 2004. And she described a queue of cars driving into New Orleans, not driving out, but driving into New Orleans, pulling, little dinghies, little rowing boats, whatever they had, bringing it as an aid to their neighbours, to people that they didn't know, but who they knew needed them. So I do think, and Rebecca Solnit's work shows this, that people are very collective and collaborative, and they respond to each other really well in times of crisis. And that gives me great hope that whatever insecurity we're facing into, that we will be able as a society to draw on the good values that we have, the collective orientations that we have to collaborate with each other, to care for each other, to mind each other, and that we need to actually remember that and remember that we are good people and that the people we are working with have good values, because it's too easy to believe the doomsday sayers that everybody's evil and everybody's individual and all that, when we know in our own lives, in our own families, in our own neighbourhoods, that actually our experience of society is quite good. So I think the pandemic reminds us of it at a macro level, but I think more recent events in Spain reminded us again that we need to bring those messages of hope and trust and belief in the future, belief that there will be a secure future that's worth fighting for. And I think an eco-social that is one way to do it. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, for such an inspiring and powerful lecture. I think everyone agrees that we can't be anything but inspired by that. And also, I forgot to mention earlier, thank you from my own union and others for the work that you've done to try and support some of the campaigns that we're running, like the More Power to You campaign, which definitely supports the idea of democracy working for you. So I appreciate that. Our respondent is Dr. Larry O'Connell. He is the director of the National Economic and Social Council, where he leads an interdisciplinary team. Prior to becoming director in 2019, Larry worked as a senior economist in NESC on a range of policy issues, including climate change, housing, and higher education funding. During his earlier career, he worked in Teagasc, the higher education sector, and in Louis Dreyfus in London. His PhD is in internationalisation of Irish businesses, and he's going to speak for 20 minutes. So over to you, Larry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. And thank you to Tom and to the NERI Institute for this invitation to respond to Professor Murphy's lecture. It really has been a stimulating, thought-provoking, and I think very important lecture. And it is a real honour to be the first person to respond to what I'm sure will be, and be part of what I'm sure will be an amazing discussion this evening. Mary has and indeed continues to shape Irish social policy and practice, I think because of her unrelenting focus on identifying and understanding the causes of inequality and challenging all of us in Ireland and across the globe really to respond with urgency and ambition. I think one of the core strengths, and we've seen that this evening, is the way in which she so deeply connects to and is passionate about the issues as they impact on specific communities and cohorts and groups, and in particular women. I think it shows tonight that she cares deeply and she really wants to affect meaningful change on these islands and beyond. And I think the link that she's now making in her work and identifying this deep causal relationship between climate change and inequality, I think is really groundbreaking. So in my response, I just want to touch on three aspects of the lecture. It really is hard to do justice to it even in 20 minutes, but there's three things I want to focus on. The first, I want to talk about imagination, and the second about social dialogue, and thirdly, to talk about some next steps. I think what Mary vividly shows us and explains is that the current overall system really isn't delivering or doing enough for so many of our people, and it's not delivering or protecting the environment or our natural assets. She provides an interesting and subtle, but I think very important insight on the way forward, as having big imaginative ideas about the direction of travel and the capacity to define the smaller first steps in travelling down that route. And I think in her book, she refers to this as being a trick. And I think that's absolutely right. I think it's always going to be a little bit mysterious. I think it's always going to be a process of going back and forth between where we actually want to get to and the first steps that we need to take. So the trick which can bring about transformative change seems to begin by accepting that the precise future and shape of policy isn't fully known. But there is, and I think this is very clear in the lecture tonight, there's a really shared commitment that there are fundamental shortcomings. And then the key is that we have to get started. We have to take the initial steps and based on those go back and reassess continually what might be possible to raise our ambition, to then rethink what might be the big idea or the goal that we're trying to get to as we go. So Mary highlighted the following insight, I think, based on Astra Taylor's, which I think is really quite brilliant, which is that change is inevitable, but the challenge is to make it transformative. I think she reminds us that in trying to tackle that there isn't really a policy blueprint. So in framing the challenge in that way, and in these terms, I think she directs our attention to the seeds of the past and the present, that if we nurture them and support them, can grow into a transformative future. And she's named these as being things like participation income, universal basic services, the rights to more services, guarantees around work and pensions. And I think all of these in various ways can be traced back to the ideas that were there in the seminal work by NESC in the developmental welfare state. And on these issues, I think we continue to have to be open-minded and very determined to find fresh ways of working. And NESC, I think, is fully supportive of the agenda that Mary's outlined in that sense. The key lesson that I take away from the lecture, or our key lesson, is that there must be a commitment to travel, to go somewhere. There is a challenge to staying put, and there's a challenge to the status quo. I would like to add a small little caveat, and it is that I think there is a barrier to that imagination and learning that we need. A barrier is that many advocates for change, who see, rightly in my view, that we need to have a transformative change, are often, I think, a little bit disparaging of those smaller first steps. Even more so, I think they're often quick to assume that the initial smaller steps are small because the traveller doesn't want to go on a journey. They're often a little bit less open to the argument that the traveller heading out into new places and on new journeys may actually be experiencing very profound difficulties and challenges. So put in other terms, I think that the path to transformative change often is more a series of small loops than one straight linear line. So in NESC, when we look at these issues, look at issues like agriculture, just transition and climate change, we're intensely interested in farmers, communities and innovative projects and why they are finding it difficult. What are they finding as the blockages? What are the fears they have? And accepting this, I think, has implications for how progress of a sector is discussed and how targets and ceilings are set and evaluated. The tendency, I believe, that slow progress will be addressed or helped by higher or more stringent targets, in my view, is neither commonly correct nor is rarely helpful. What I think is needed instead is that we're willing to work through the complex problems, and the key to developing ambitious and achievable progress is then co-creation. As Mary makes clear, there isn't a clear blueprint for transformative change. I think the onus on all of us is to create and co-create it together. So that brings me to the second aspect of Mary's lecture this evening, I think, which is the role of trade unions and social dialogue. In my view, in seeking to unlock our imagination and our creative capacity to develop a better, more just, inclusive and sustainable future, Mary refers to the capacity to merge knowledge from different sources. He rightly points to the role of trade unions in providing insights into the issues that cause insecurity across civil society and of helping us to generate a sense of belonging and trust. More than ever, we operate in a world where we need to build that trust, to hear from and understand lived experiences. Trade unions, and indeed all of our social partners, operate in a world where it is often hard to trust the veracity of information and where change is pervasive. So against that backdrop, trade unions increasingly provide a trusted means of communication and knowledge transfer from the front line into policy and back. And they are, I believe, a key means of assessing and developing what might be termed the legitimacy of policy, action and ambition, because I think they help to gauge what people want and what they will support, and based on where those people are and their lived experiences and their work context. So I use the word communication in that context, but I mean it in a very deep and resource-intensive way. I think it takes a lot of time to engage properly and respectfully with people where they are. In our work, the trade unions are integrally involved in helping to deepen our understanding of issues and of figuring ways forward. In the last 2 years, that's involved working on just transition in agriculture, on developing a forward-looking ambitious strategy for better work, and more recently on land use and energy. In each of these projects, the engagements have taken different forms and have involved different people, including colleagues in NERI. I do think it would be remiss of me not to mention our great friend and colleague, MacDara Doyle, who passed away suddenly this year. MacDara was a real true champion for a better future for all, and particularly for the idea of just transition. He was really active and energetic member of the Just Transition Task Force, which established the Just Transition Commission. I think he's really missed in the policy system, and hopefully the Commission will come to be the type of imaginative and innovative institution that he would be proud of. Although I have to say, from my time working with MacDara, he wasn't always that easy to please. So I think the Just Transition Commission are going to have to work quite hard to reach the standards he would set. So for us, the social dialogue among partners, when it's at its most impactful, focuses on advice around steps that could be taken and reimagining how to support or scale progress or to remove blockages. In our work on just transition in agriculture, that included a focus on reimagining the research, advisory and regulatory practices in agriculture. In the work we've done on better work, it focused on demonstrating the case for better work linked to better terms and conditions and better pay was shown to deliver tangible and significant benefits for employees, for employers and a wider economy and society. Collective representation, employee voice and other forms of workplace democracy were key enablers of those win-win-win outcomes. And the work also highlighted the importance of sectoral challenges and issues, the need to widen the focus of enterprise policy to include key sectors like tourism and retail and smaller domestic micro-enterprises. I think this illustrates our mandate, and I hope how it that it shows how it aligns with the call for institutional imagination and the role of social dialogue outlined by Mary. I think it also demonstrates our theory of change, so to speak, which is to take seriously the need to look at change from multiple angles, and in doing to try to craft or even co-create ambitious and feasible ways of moving forward. Mary very usefully highlights the range of institutions and means by which social dialogue is now taking place. She mentions NESC, LEAF, and various commissions like Tax and Welfare, Low Pay, and the Just Transition Commission. I think looked at in the round, there is now a very rich tapestry for dialogue. But I think the challenge must be to continue to use these various means of dialogue to deepen engagement and to ensure that the conversations are problem solving and that they're focused on delivering the type of real change that moves us towards Mary's North Star. There certainly needs to be greater emphasis on the co-design and co-delivery of imaginative and innovative solutions. I think the various forums for social dialogue cannot be talking shops. The best argument, I think, for social dialogue is effective and quality social dialogue. And there's a parallel here to the phrase we often heard at NESC from Peter McClure, which was that the best argument for bigger public services is a quality public service. The responsibility of people of people in positions of influence in trade unions and in our other stakeholder groups on NESC and civil society organisations, on academics and experts and on those in governments, is to focus on what Mary calls the ultimate challenge, and that is the challenge of time. We are running out of time, and the most critical issue is to find ways to accept and nurture the seeds that she mentioned. I think also to pull out the weeds that are in the way, and to get out of the way of change and to accelerate the art of the possible. She mentions again Astor Taylor's idea of coming together as things fall apart, which I think is incredibly powerful. And in the world we live, that really seems like something that we can and all should grab hold of. So bringing me to my final issue, which is what I can consider is the next steps. I think policymakers and citizens are really now operating in an unprecedented era of uncertainty, including, as I mentioned, in relation to the trustworthiness of so much information. There's also a relentless and usually valid pressure to respond to the issues of today with a focus on policy delivery responses which are most immediate. Public expectations are higher than ever before as to what government can and should deliver. There are also more voices in the public policy debate, often focusing on policy concerns specific to one sector or group. And while this is enriching in many ways, it can make it increasingly difficult to distill out what are the key issues, to have deeper debates about challenges, potential trade-offs, and solutions which can help build consensus around choices and priorities. So I think to create the type of better future envisioned by Mary, we need to create more space in NESC and elsewhere for discussions which can take uncertainty and difference seriously, which releases even temporarily from the immediate need for a solution, and which allows us to think more systematically and to connect more of the dots. In NESC, we do work hard to create that type of space, and as I say, I think more are needed, and I also think Mary's called that more which are state-free are also needed. I think that's needed if we're going to develop and enrich our democracy, to widen it and deepen it, as Mary suggests. So I think we need more spaces for meaningful conversation about our future, where we can be honest, where we can be brave, and sometimes we can have difficult discussions among experts, non-experts, users, citizens about the challenges, trade-offs, and synergies. Last year was the 50th anniversary of NESC, and we took the time to take a little bit about the role of NESC, and indeed Mary was involved in our conference at the end of the year. And really, we felt that Ireland is at a pivotal moment, and that there was a real need to look at what were the big questions that NESC would focus on over the coming number of years. And there are just 5 that I just want to mention briefly. So the Council, through the process of social dialogue, really now wants to reflect and work on how Ireland can navigate forward in the face of the deep forces for change that we know exist around trying to live within planetary boundaries, the changing trajectories of demography and migration, the promise and challenge of artificial intelligence, and the profound geopolitical tensions. Secondly, the Council really wants to help to reframe discussion of demography and migration by providing a detailed factual account about the issues and looking at how both migration and demographic change can be instrumental in helping us reduce rather than magnify existing pressures and capacity constraints in Ireland. The Council believes that there's a growing tendency to view demographic change, in particular the growing population of older people in our society and migration, in a negative way. It considers this view to be very short-sighted. It is outdated as regards older people's capacity to participate and live full and independent lives, and I think misunderstands the reality of the role of migration in the modern world. So for us, we think it misses the opportunities in positive ways that both an ageing population and migration can give us a chance to reorganise and imagine whole areas of our society, including care, housing and education, and in doing so to help promote a much more inclusive and socially cohesive future. And thirdly, in line with the thinking and development DWS, the Council really does believe that we cannot rely on tax and welfare reforms alone to deliver equality of opportunity, and the day of assuming that citizens are passive recipients of policy is over. So the Council wishes to deepen its focus on the disconnects between government's efforts to do the right thing and the lived experience or what is actually delivered. So I think that will mean further work on the social, particularly in social and environmental policy, and what might be termed how to design to deliver. This would focus on how services can be designed such that professional and organisational boundaries would be respected, but also ensuring that there's sufficient mandate to allow people to cooperate and collaborate to deliver services, especially complex services. Fourthly, the Council will explore how building up our climate and biodiversity resilience can be a means by which Ireland shows leadership in the world, where on foot of our ambitious laws and statutory commitments, Ireland can demonstrate how to bring about meaningful change to the tangible ways we support and protect our key natural assets on land and sea. So NESC would like to emphasise and showcase how to build consensus around achieving transition to a decarbonised economy and society. And fifth and finally, the Council is very keen to examine the issues linked to ongoing digitalisation and generative AI, looking at issues like the appropriate technological and regulatory landscape, the impact of AI on work and services, its adoption and diffusion across key public and private sector activities, and the issue of cybersecurity. So I think these 5 areas are informed, and hopefully Mary will agree that they're reasonably well aligned with the ambitious vision and action plan contained within tonight's lecture. In closing, and to steal Mary's insights, which I think I'll use a lot now, the idea that the things that can bring us together as things fall apart, I think that they are a shared commitment to leave nobody behind and to leave the planet better than we found it. As I said, the deep causal link between inequality and climate that Mary is helping us to see, I think is the focal point around which we can unite. So in that sense, I would close as I began by thanking Mary for the inspiration and the challenge I think that she provides me, for all of my colleagues in NESC, and for so many others in the policy system and the wider networks of activists. Thank you very much, Mary.
Thank you very much, Larry, and it was such an insightful and informative response. I'd now welcome you up if you don't mind taking a seat up at the top here. It's going to bring us into the question and answer section of today's event.